occurred throughout the West that's been characterized, I think, quite accurately as a narco-tyranny. It's anarchy for the favored clients of the corrupt regime and absolute tyranny for basically everyone else.
So, Darren, you know, as we all do, that Matt Gaetz is at the center of the storm, perhaps the scariest appointment that Donald Trump has made, scariest for the left. They're going to use every tool in their kit to derail the appointment. But Trump says he's all in. And you say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. So tell us why Matt Gaetz is the indispensable attorney general.
Absolutely. Well, there's some table setting in order. For those who've been paying the slightest bit of attention, there's been some deeply disturbing trends within our government, basically beginning with the moment Trump stepped into the political arena. There's been a total corruption, repurposing, and weaponization of our bureaucracies, not for the purposes for which they're intended, but rather for petty and malicious political purposes. And we've seen that across the board. And we reported on this extensively at Revolver.news, whether it be in the intelligence community or the Justice Department or wherever. But there's a certain difference. You know, when it comes to the intelligence community, we kind of expect them to be dirty and play dirty. We only hope that on occasion, at least, they would play dirty advancing the interests of the American people rather than conspiring against the American people. But we never expect them to be fully above board, and there's a certain kind of murkiness that's ingrained in the very function of the intelligence role, which is not to excuse what they've done. We need to clean them up too. But there's something different when it comes to the Department of Justice. There's something that gets more centrally to the core of our self-conception as Americans, what distinguishes us from other countries, namely that we live in a system governed by the rule of law with blind justice, without, fear or favor to appropriate something from a different category. But basically, we're not the kind of country like these other third world nations where, the tin pot dictators will appropriate the law enforcement agencies of the country in order to go after their political enemies. And it was really only after Biden Harris began to do that, the wave of lawfare assaults against Trump, not only Trump, but his supporters, that you started to hear this term banana republic in the context of our country, which used to be great and which Biden, Harris, and others drove into the ground. And I think that really speaks to what I'm saying about the core self-perception. And so all of this is to say that there needs to be a cleaning across the board, but there's something central about the Department of Justice almost at a symbolic level in terms of where our country stands in relation to our values and our self-conception. Then there's a political dimension, which is that Donald Trump has learned through past experience that in some ways his presidency can only be as strong as his attorney general is loyal and willing to fight. If that's putting it too strongly, it's at least fair to say that having unfortunate attorneys general amounted to a kind of Achilles heel of the first term around. And it's not just about having someone who is capable of running the department, which is profoundly important in its own right. It's that if the attorney general is not willing to stand up for Trump and the agenda, that can introduce problems that end up sucking so much bandwidth and energy that it compromises the president's ability to implement the agenda across the board in other domains. And so that's why another reason why the DOJ is the most important appointment. So we've established the importance of the DOJ. Now let's move to who is capable and who must be the person to run it. Now, that's going to be Matt Gaetz, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. One reason is he has the loyalty totally on lock. He has unquestioned, unwavered loyalty not only to Trump, but to the agenda that Trump ran on and has pursued since 2016. Very few, I don't think there's anyone who surpasses him in terms of this demonstrated loyalty. So there's a combination of loyalty to the agenda and to the person of Trump. He has the expertise. He is an exceptional lawyer. He understands how the Department of Justice works. He understands how the legal system works very well. And he's a very savvy person. He's a very acute person. He's not this, there's this sense that, oh, he's just a guy who goes in willy-nilly and breaks stuff. No, no, he's very surgical, very intelligent, very precise. And we've seen this in how he's comported himself in his political career. He's willing to take big risks, and when he does that, they usually pay off because he's effective and intelligent. Um, and the third reason that I think is not to be discounted at all is that other than Trump, he more than any other single individual has personally experienced the brunt and the ramification of the very corruption that he has now been appointed to address. The persecution against him with these sham investigations. I mean, you think about the fact that the DOJ that was so aggressive in pursuing this witch hunt will basically arrest any grandma who stepped foot within the Capitol on January 6th. Even this monomaniacally insane Department of Justice didn't have enough to indict Gates. I think that says a lot about the sham nature of the charges against him, just as we know the sham charges against Trump. And so someone who's been through that fire, who's withstood that fire and come out stronger, that's a very direct and personal test that very few people have had to endure. Trump has obviously had to endure it at the highest level, but I'd say other than Trump, I can't think of anyone more than Matt Gaetz himself who's endured those trials and who's come ahead and through it even stronger. So I think the combination of demonstrated loyalty, intelligence and capability, and sort of personal investment and stake, I think the combination of those things really is unique to Matt Gaetz and why he's the one guy to do it. So that's why I say he's the indispensable guy for the indispensable job of cleaning up the Department of Justice, which is the precondition for the broader cleaning that's required throughout the government bureaucracies as a whole.
Yeah, because in America, the founding of our nation on the rule of law as opposed to the rule of men, where men choose which laws for which men. Who is it? Stalin's guy who said, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime."
Right.
That's a totalitarian, socialist, authoritarian nightmare, which is where we're heading. We
To give
were,
you a sense, there's been high profile charges against Trump and against Matt Gaetz, but to give you a sense of how far it's been trickled down, one case that we've been reporting on extensively that has critical ramifications as far as First Amendment is this case against this individual called Douglas Mackey, whom the Biden administration arrested, charged under a novel, innovative interpretation of an old statute which hadn't been used in anywhere remotely close to the circumstances of this case. And his was the first time this statute was interpreted in this sense. The second time was in the sham charges against Trump. It's called conspiracy against rights. And they charged him, and he was actually convicted of a felony when his underlying offense was sharing a evidently and manifestly humorous meme mocking Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And for that, this person, he could have faced 10 years. They sentenced him to 7 months. The case is currently in appeal. That's the level of abuse. That's how low into the sewage pit Biden and Harris took our justice system, a justice system built over, centuries of tradition going all the way back to English law, going all the way back to Magna Carta. Biden and Harris just dragged it right through the sewer when they decided, you could even argue that's worse than what happened to Trump because Trump's a man in the arena. He's a man who's like, taken upon himself all of these slings and arrows as it were, whereas this is just a private citizen who's getting arrested and charged and convicted of a felony for a tweet. And it's even worse than it seems because it's not just about this one individual who is very much wronged. It's about the corrupt DOJ and really the corrupt Biden administration trying to codify this scam that they call disinformation, which has been their chief censorship predicate throughout, the past 4 years, trying to codify that into our legal system, effectively saying those who engage in what we determine to be disinformation are not only worthy of being silenced, they're worthy of being imprisoned. And
Everyone
that,
in this country can put themselves in that place. I mean, some of the time you're looking at it, well, no one's ever going to charge me with some of the things that they did with Trump. You could maybe go there. But this is a meme. This is like going to the United Kingdom right now where hundreds of people have been charged for
oh,
posts on
yeah,
Facebook or posts on X. And it's a meme. It's just saying something the things that I say every day, not even close to what I say every day, they're being put into prison for 2 and 3 years at a time.
right.
Grandmas, wives with disabled husbands, young men. They're actually being put in prison. And this gentleman, McKay, he is the best example of how quickly, or they're setting the stage for us to go where the UK is now, which is utterly especially under Keir Starmer, just,
It's a central dystopian form that's
yeah.
emerged throughout the West that's been characterized, I think, quite accurately as a narco-tyranny. It's anarchy for the favored clients of the corrupt regime and absolute tyranny for basically everyone else. Because at the same time that you have people being arrested for tweets because they're political enemies of the regime, you have third world populations just looting stores with impunity. You know,
And grooming and raping young girls and, I mean,
right. And
the
take the
murder.
example of A, you are better off raping than you are expressing a viewpoint that the regime deems to be politically incorrect. And that's borne out empirically by the legal repercussions for these two different categories. There are literal cases of, you know, migrant rapists who are dealt with in a far more lenient way than actual Britons who dare to express disapproval about, a variety of things, including immigration. And so it's really devolved into this, it's a combination of clownishness and evil because it's such a
Yes.
joke, but it's
It's the
like
insanity of evil, I call it a lot
evil
of times,
joke.
because
Yeah.
it's
It's an
like,
evil clown.
yeah, the
It's like the
clown.
Stephen King It. It's an evil
I know.
clown.
It's the perfect icon for the Justice Department. And the idea of a corrupt Justice Department, it's almost biblical in the sense that when the Lord in the Torah and the prophets and everything is talking about injustice, I used to look at it and think, wow, this kind of injustice is so hard for me to wrap my brain around. And we're living a biblical level of injustice right now. And though they don't have the clown in there, but it's, other things. The One of the things that I enjoyed about your article that's in Revolver News is the mandate, the Trump agenda or a MAGA agenda for the Department of Justice and for a Matt Gaetz. And I love the way you just said, this is not a wish list. It is a real agenda. And you hit really important issues, but I think you would agree it would take weeks to put together a full list probably of all the areas of the Justice Department, the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, whatever, that needs to be wholly radically overturned. Sunlight, salt, fresh air, it's got to be clean. It was cracking me up this morning. I was thinking, When I heard defund the police, I thought that I didn't hear it because I thought that's insane. It's insanely evil. But when we talk about tearing the Justice Department or turning it inside out or taking it down to its foundation and reimagining it, to use their terminology, or redoing it, they're horrified by that. So what is the difference between defund our local police that are on the front lines helping us uh, deter crime and investigate it and put wrongdoers in jail, and why are they so protective of the DOJ and all the rest of the panoply of departments?
Well, because they want to it's the same principle of a narco-tyranny. When they say defund the police, they mean they don't want police to be able to crack down on crime that's been ravaging and destroying our once great cities. But they want to maintain effectively a political police force that can engage in FBI raids on the political enemies. And so that's, I think, an important distinction to be made. When they say defund the police, they still want the FBI to do their dirty work politically. They just don't want police to arrest the thugs who are, making our streets into basically third world hellholes. So that's, I think, the distinction there. And there are a lot of interesting ideas put
Let me
forth in
just
this.
point, I want to go to the freedom of speech, but I want to drill down on one that I had never thought of or actually even heard of the concept or the law yet. And so this is what sparked a flame in my brain. It's the Federal False Claims Act. And
Right.
it's the first I'd ever heard it. Now, is it Cooey Tom bounty rewards?
Yeah.
Cooey
We
Tom?
can.
Tam.
Yeah.
Cooey Tam.
Yeah.
Tell me about Cooey Tam and the Federal False Claims Act.
Yeah, well, I mean, the expression itself is just an old Latin expression that comes from the common law tradition. It basically means for the king. But in the context here, what it means is some people might be familiar that in the case of the IRS and taxes and certain areas in medical domain, basically any whistleblower has legal standing to expose fraudulent activity against the federal government. And by virtue of these qui tam bounty provisions, those whistleblowers are actually entitled to a part of the recovered funds. So there's this financial incentive. To put it another way, you rat out somebody engaging in tax fraud, you can recuperate some of the money that, so there's an incentive there. And there's no reason in terms of the principle and the origin of the law that it should be confined to those categories. So one of the many, I would say, maybe creative possibilities at the disposal of a creative and energetic attorney general would be to expand the scope of application for something like that to include, for instance, people who engage in whistleblowing against universities that are lying to the government, because right now it's illegal for universities to engage in racial discrimination, in other words, affirmative action. And so we could expand those bounty provisions to say, okay, anyone who exposes universities is still engaging in this racial discrimination when the universities have maintained that they didn't, and that's a condition on their federal grants. Well, that's a huge financial incentive for people to expose what's going on in these universities and could help to cripple the rampant racial discrimination going on in universities against very qualified people and restore the basis of meritocracy, which is, of course, another precondition. Like, one thing that's important to say is all of these things, Elon, Vivek, Matt Gaetz, all of these great people who are appointed to very important positions here, what are the stakes involved? The stakes go beyond just, the politics of a successful second term. The stakes literally setting the preconditions for an entire century of success and flourishing for our country. If we truly engage in the deep cleaning and resetting, cutting the bureaucracy, cleaning out the hornet's nest, restoring meritocracy, restoring rule of law, establishing the conditions for energy independence, All of these things are setting up the United States to thrive at the highest level and maintain our position as the global superpower that's also a free country. Because, this is another thing that we see with like the rise of China and these other places, but also the direction that the United States is going in is people simply assume that being a free society with a good standard of living for the vast majority of the middle class, that that's necessarily concurrent with sort of global hegemony, when that's really not the case. These two things don't have to go together. And so a successful second term done in the right way can secure the preconditions for both of those things, not only the absolute essential continuance of American dominance on the world stage, but what's the point of being dominant on the world stage if people are getting arrested for tweets, if your cities look like filth, if you walk around, what's the point? Like, what's the point of, the dollar being the main currency and maybe like a handful of energy companies and financiers? Like, there's no point to being the world's number one if our citizens too are not free and thriving. And so the second term done effectively really can set the conditions for both. That's what's at stake here. That's what's at stake. And people, on one hand, people can think of, oh, these people are disruptors, Gates disruptors, and there's some disruption involved, but ultimately it's a very kind of conservative function in the sense that in order for the nation to thrive and even for these institutions to thrive ultimately, they have to have their legitimacy restored. And the only way to restore the legitimacy of the Department of Justice, of the Department of Defense, name whatever department you want, in order to restore the legitimacy, you need to clean house. You need to clean out the poison because there's been a legitimacy crisis for a very real reason. People don't trust these institutions for good reason. So to reestablish genuine trust, you have to expose the crimes and the corruption that happened before. You need to establish accountability for those responsible for that and set these institutions and by extension the country on the right basis for, okay, people can actually look at these institutions as legitimate once again.
I think that the founding fathers, you would agree, were extraordinarily, remarkably prescient in that these young men, mostly young men, put together a constitutional framework that, I mean, is practically a flawless document. But they weren't God, right? And so they set this foundation, and it did well. And they anticipated so many things, such as with the Electoral College, which is so essential to a federal republic. But they can't anticipate hundreds of years out every um, every exigency, that might rear its ugly head, like the internet changed everything because of the speed and the breadth, the invasiveness of the Department of Justice or the FBI, because they can just go and track you without ever leaving their offices, this kind of thing. But we have built up for decades upon decades upon decades the infrastructure of tyranny. And it's reaching in sort of an apex, and this 2024 election shut that down. And now if we continue, which we're not going to just nibble around the edges in 4 years or 8 or whatever it is before they're back in power, or the neocon type Republicans are back in power, we have to prevent that. But if we're nibbling around the edges, they just go in with executive orders, overturn 100, 200 executive orders, put in 2 or 3 or 400, start passing laws, and we're back to start on the board game. And I think what you're saying, what I'm saying, and Steve Bannon, and I mean, just everyone out there, is we have got to we have to build the defenses. We have to build the foundation again. And I call it hardening of the revolution. In other words, that they can't dismantle it with executive orders. And if that's all we're doing is executive order reforms, then they're just going to be rolled back. And so that's one reason that I loved the this federal false claims act. I think that your idea of a First Amendment agency or task force rather that is attempting to again harden the well I'm using that term building a structure by which it cannot be dismantled like the founding fathers had for so much time. So what are your thoughts are on preventing the McKays, the uh, Merrick Garland in the Oklahoma City bombing? I mean, you could just go through these injustices, and how do we make sure it doesn't we don't flip back?
Well, it's a broad agenda there that requires a number of specific things. We've advanced a number of those ideas in the piece. In Revolver.news, you mentioned one, which is the free speech task force, which could be like a nerve center pertaining to the defense of the First Amendment. And also, if there are more things out there like the Twitter files, which does reveal, I think, illegal violations of the First Amendment on behalf of some former government officials even, those things can and should be prosecuted. The DOJ has a lot of files pertaining to things, people aren't familiar with Revolver.news. One of the main things that we did was reshape the national conversation on January 6th, such that people understand that it's not an insurrection, it was a Fedsurrection. The FBI is a big part of that. That can come out in the context of new DOJ leadership. Obviously, Russiagate files on that can come out all the way back to Oklahoma City, which you mentioned. And, for those who don't know, Merrick Garland was one of the key architects of the cover-up there, which is a very dark and dirty chapter of American history. And all of these things can be exposed in order to reestablish legitimacy, but also to reinforce this America First mandate into the future to further discredit the criminals who are buttressed in the mainstream media. But if the true extent of their crimes is revealed, I think that will make it even harder for them to regain power.
That's key. What you
You
just said, I've heard more than one person, and I wholeheartedly agree that if you open up those classified documents, what do we have? A billion classified documents, something ridiculous, a million, billion um, classified documents, and you open up these cover-ups, or you open up the classified documents, you release them, and people, um, I've heard it said that when people see how bad the injustice, the criminal conspiracy of the Justice Department, FBI, and the cover-ups, how much American, maybe perhaps the CIA has been involved in crimes that were covered up, and the FBI, that will it'll be a paradigm shift that has 100 years before it could ever be turned back because people will be so appalled they'll never look at the government the same way again. Is that kind of the idea there?
Yeah, that's the idea, is choose, sort of more of the egregious crimes. And I'm sure that there are files that expose these things going all the way back to Oklahoma City, but, also
Or
more recent,
JFK and
January
RFK.
6th
Yeah.
and other things. So that's another provision we have. Another one is to sever the relationships that the DOJ and FBI have with these malicious organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in fact, maybe even turn the tables around and launch a criminal investigation, because the SPLC is a very questionable organization. And I suspect that even a kind of perfunctory look at things would be able to sustain criminal charges. That kind of thinking, I think, is important. Farah, the left has weaponized Farah against us, but there are legitimate uses of Farah because a lot of these people engaged in the censorship industry are working in effect as agents of other governments, including Germany, including the UK. Not, usually you hear this in the context of Russia or something, but a lot of these people in the censorship industry are working out of
Define
institutions
FARA for
that
those
are
who don't
funded
know.
by and promoted by
Foreign,
European
well,
governments.
define FARA because some people are not going to know it's about foreign agents.
It's just if you're working at the behest of a foreign person or foreign institution, you're required usually to register under something called Farah, which is basically registering publicly as a lobbyist for some kind of
A foreign
foreign
agent.
entity. Yes,
Exactly.
foreign agent
And
registration. I
how does
think
that relate to, say, Qatari money flooding into even down to elementary schools, but throughout our universities, Confucius centers that are being
mm,
set up? Do you think that there needs to be some kind of act or investigations shutting down the foreign influence in our education system that's not just about registering as a foreign lobbyist or agent, but actually shutting down the foreign influence of our enemies or those who are undermining our philosophical framework and our freedoms in our country?
Um, yes, I think where appropriate, I think one of the places that's appropriate is, I mean, the foreign influence that I consider to be most malicious is the foreign influence advocating for censorship. So that's why I specified going after the people who are advocating for censorship on behalf of foreign nations. Other than that, my own position is I want to maximize the allowable speech, wherever it comes from. And there's, obviously foreign influence when it comes to speech. But I think one of the real pernicious things that the Biden administration did was to censor under the pretext of clamping down on foreign information. For instance, they would say, oh, you're not allowed to say this because you're engaging in Russian disinformation. Well, you're not engaging in disinformation. You're just saying something that this a certain faction of the U.S. government opposes, and they're saying, okay, this is maybe in some narrow sense aligned with one interest the Russian government might have, doesn't make it Russian disinformation. So I think in general terms, there's been an abuse of this thing of shutting down conversation using the pretext of saying this is foreign disinformation. I think the generally speaking, the worst stuff comes from within. The worst stuff, there's no like Russian, Chinese, Iranian, you pick, the worst adversaries. There's the worst stuff, unfortunately, comes from inside the house. All of the woke, all of the poison, the enemy within, all of that stuff, it's not engineered and really promoted. It's derivatively promoted by foreign countries, but its source is actually the United States itself and malicious elements within the United States. And those elements have been most aggressive in promoting censorship. And so I think so much can be handled simply by maximizing free speech within the United States. Because look, if the whole idea of democratic governance is predicated on the citizens' capability to absorb, process, deliberate upon information, that presupposes an open and free public square, like what Elon has been saying. So I think we need to really maximize that. And we've already done a great job with, frankly, Elon acquiring X has been monumental shift, far more than any kind of policy measure adopted by the government. Um, but there's a lot more that needs to be done to dismantle what is called the censorship industrial complex.
Give me your final thoughts on Matt Gaetz, the Department of Justice, and any other aspect of this upcoming
Yeah.
battle, which actually I'm going to have popcorn. I cannot wait to watch the hearings for. But tell me, your final thoughts on this.
Well, as far as it goes with Gates, I think this is the indispensable man for the indispensable job. It is the significance of the appointment is such that it really sets the narrative that contextualizes the other appointments. The Gates appointment shows Trump means business. Trump is very serious, and Trump is going to get it done. Therefore, it has to get done, and that's why Trump is all in. And so what we can do is help to convey that message to senators and other people who might be weaker, might be intimidated, and say, look, Trump endured the coordinated hostility of every powerful institution on earth in 2016, and he won. The bureaucracies did everything in their power to subvert his presidency and to malign his presidency. There, I think, questions now retroactively when you look at 2020, that in terms of the votes, I think the votes in 2024 cast retroactively suspicion on what they say happened in 2020. So we'll leave that for the audience to infer. But in any case, in 2024, he endured an onslaught of weaponized and illegal lawfare, and most terrifying. He was shot in the head and survived, and then went on to win in an historic popular vote victory, historic electoral vote victory, both houses of Congress, achieved a mandate. All this is to say he deserves to have the people that he appoints helping him run the country. He's earned it. The American people have spoken and they want Trump. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. There's no equivocation whatsoever. If anything in the history of American politics has been a mandate, it has been this: for God's sake, give him the people that he needs to carry on